for 8 straight days. The most celebrated team of luxury automotive specialists in the city burned through more than $500,000 trying to resurrect $1 million Bugatti that had gone completely, inexplicably silent. They dismantled the engine in sections, flew in rare components on chartered freight, and wired the car to diagnostic machines, so advanced they required their own dedicated power supply. They consulted remotely with engineers in Stuttgart and Milan. They replaced parts that had never been replaced on a car this age, components so scarce that sourcing them alone cost more than most people earned in a year. And still, after all of it, after every expert opinion, every precision instrument, every late night fueled by espresso and professional desperation, the Bugatti sat exactly where it had been placed on arrival. Dark, cold, and completely, humiliatingly dead. The garage where all of this unfolded was not the kind of place ordinary people stumbled into. Elysian Motor Works occupied the ground floor of a converted industrial building in the financial district, its floor-to-ceiling glass facade revealing a showroom that looked more like a contemporary art gallery than a repair shop. The lighting was tuned to a warm amber that made every chrome surface glow like something sacred. The floor was sealed concrete, polished to a mirror finish, and the workstations were arranged with the deliberate geometry of a space that understood itself as performance as much as function. The air carried the faint, expensive scent of leather conditioning oil and climate-controlled precision, the smell of money being taken seriously. Clients did not drop their cars off here. They arranged appointments through a private liaison, sometimes weeks in advance, and they arrived in other vehicles just as extraordinary, stepping out with the ease of people who had never had to wait for anything. They spoke in the measured tones of individuals accustomed to being taken seriously, asked precisely the right questions, and left with the absolute confidence that their machines were in hands worthy of them. Elysian did not advertise. It did not need to. Its reputation among the ultra-wealthy was the only marketing it had ever required. And that reputation had been built over 2 decades on a single, immovable promise. No matter the problem, no matter the vehicle, no matter how obscure or specialized or seemingly impossible, the diagnosis Elysian would solve it. That promise was not printed anywhere. It did not need to be. Everyone who walked through those glass doors already knew it, and everyone who worked inside them understood that the promise was the whole of their professional identity, and that the day it failed would be the day Elysian ceased to be what it was. The Bugatti in question belonged to Harrison Mercer, a collector whose name appeared regularly in the kind of publications that tracked the movements of serious automotive wealth. The car was a Veyron Grand Sport Vitesse, one of a limited run of fewer than 100 in the world, finished in a deep cobalt blue that shifted to nearly black under artificial light and seemed almost alive under the sun. It had spent the last 3 years in a climate-controlled private hangar outside Geneva, maintained quarterly by a dedicated technician who flew in from Munich at Mercer's expense, kept in a state of mechanical perfection that had cost, over those 3 years, more than most people spent on housing. Mercer had decided to have it shipped to the States for a charity auction at which it was expected to fetch somewhere north of $2 million, a figure that represented a profit even after the costs of storage, maintenance, and international transport. And that would benefit a foundation whose name Mercer was careful to mention in interviews. The auction was in 11 days. The car had been loaded onto an international freight carrier, sealed in a pressurized transport container with a humidity and temperature monitoring system that logged readings every 6 minutes, transported across the Atlantic under protocols that cost more per mile than most people spent on a vehicle outright, cleared customs in New Jersey without incident, and then driven very carefully, very slowly, by a specialist transport driver who had been briefed on the car's value and significance for 45 minutes before he was given the keys the final 40 miles to Elysian. It had arrived looking perfect, every surface immaculate, every component exactly where it had been when the technician in Munich had last signed off on it. It had refused to start since the moment they unloaded it. Vanessa Cole ran the technical division of Elysian Motor Works with the kind of authority that made newer employees speak in lower voices when she passed through a room. She was 35 years old, with the sharp, angular confidence of someone who had fought for every credential she possessed and had decided, somewhere along the way, that those credentials entitled her to a particular kind of respect, a respect she expected to be offered immediately, without question and without exception. Her engineering degrees from two well-regarded institutions hung in matching frames on her office wall. Her published papers on high-performance electrical systems were cited in trade journals whose readership included people who ran departments far larger than hers. She drove a matte black sports sedan and wore her dark hair pulled back with a severity that matched her preferred management style. And she had built, over 6 years at Elysian, a team that was by every measurable technical standard among the best in the country. She had hired carefully, trained relentlessly, and held everyone who worked under her to a standard so high that the ones who stayed were genuinely exceptional. The problem with Vanessa was not her competence. The problem with Vanessa was that she had, at some point in her career, made a decision, quiet, private, probably never consciously articulated, that competence and character were the same thing, that being technically right was equivalent to being right in all the ways that mattered. She was not cruel in the way of people who enjoy cruelty. She was cruel in the way of people who have confused intelligence with superiority, who have decided that because they understand difficult things, they are therefore above being challenged by simpler ones, or by people whose position in the building's hierarchy did not match their value. She had built a team that reflected her values, credentialed, fast-moving, technically impressive, and deeply, systematically unwilling to admit uncertainty or to hear things from sources she had not approved. Raymond Okafor had worked the night cleaning shift at Elysian for nearly 2 years. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that showed the evidence of decades of physical labor, calloused palms, the kind of grip that tightened on things instinctively, as though every object he touched deserved to be held properly. He wore the same gray uniform every night, its fabric laundered to a faded softness, and he kept his tools mop, bucket, the small cart with its cleaning supplies arranged with a precision that was entirely his own, with a neatness that no one at Elysian seemed to notice or remark upon. He arrived each evening at 9, worked through until 4 in the morning, and was usually gone by the time the day shift technicians began filtering in, their coffees in hand and their conversations already technical before they had reached their workstations. He did not talk much. He did not invite conversation or extend it when it was offered. He moved through the gleaming space with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility was its own form of peace, and that peace was something worth protecting even when, especially when, what you had once been before the quiet was larger and louder and more visible than the life you had chosen since. What people did not notice about Raymond, because they did not look at him long enough to notice anything, was that he never simply walked past a vehicle without looking at it. Not a casual glance, a real look, the kind of sustained, focused attention that mechanics give to things they are trying to understand, that engineers give to problems they have not yet solved. He would pause beside an engine bay left open by the day team and study what was exposed with the unhurried patience of someone reading a language he knew fluently. He read the technical annotations left on whiteboards, equations, system diagrams, fault trees with the same quiet focus he brought to everything else. When a new vehicle arrived in the shop, he would circle it once on his first pass with the mop, close enough to observe without appearing to, and then carry whatever he had seen with him for the rest of the shift. He had been doing this since his first week at Elysian, and in 2 years, not a single person who worked there had asked him why. On the 3rd day of the Bugatti crisis, Vanessa had caught Raymond mopping within 15 feet of where the car was roped off. She had stopped mid-sentence in a conversation with her lead technician, turned, and addressed Raymond the way one might address a piece of furniture that had inconveniently moved itself. "This area is restricted," she said, which I believe was explained to all cleaning staff. Raymond had looked at her. He had not apologized. He had simply redirected his mop, slowly, without expression, back toward the far end of the garage floor. Vanessa had watched him go with an expression of mild distaste, then turned back to her conversation as though the interruption had already been forgotten. A young technician named Caleb, 26 years old and 3 months into his position at Elysian, had watched the exchange, and felt the specific discomfort of someone who has witnessed something small but wrong, and knows they are too junior to say anything about it. The Bugatti was, by every measurable standard, a corpse in carbon fiber and titanium. Vanessa had catalogued its failures with the thoroughness of someone building a legal defense. The primary electrical system was non-responsive. The ECU, the engine control unit, the electronic brain that governed every function of the car, showed no signal whatsoever when connected to diagnostic tools. The ignition produced nothing, no cranking, no flickering, not even the faint click of a relay attempting to engage. The battery, which had been replaced on day 2 at considerable expense, registered full charge and delivered it nowhere. A specialist from a Bugatti dealer in Florida had joined them via video conference on day 4, reviewed the data, and concluded with confident authority that the ECU itself had been damaged, possibly by a voltage irregularity during transport, and would need to be replaced, a part that would need to be sourced from the manufacturer directly, that would take a minimum of 3 weeks, and that would arrive with a price tag steep enough to make even Harrison Mercer's assistant pause before confirming the order. Vanessa had nodded through the entire consultation, asked 3 precise technical follow-up questions that demonstrated she had understood everything, and then authorized the search for a replacement ECU, while simultaneously ordering the team to continue investigating. Because she was not yet willing to tell her client that an 11-day deadline was impossible. The garage had been quietly sectioned off around the Bugatti. A pair of portable barriers and a length of black velvet rope created a perimeter that felt both clinical and vaguely ceremonial, as though the car were a patient in an ICU whose condition was too serious for casual visitors. Inside the perimeter, Vanessa's team worked in overlapping shifts, logging everything, photographing every component, running the same tests in slightly different sequences, in hope that some variation in approach might yield a different result. Outside the perimeter, the rest of Elysian's work continued: other vehicles, other clients, other problems, but with a subdued undercurrent of tension that everyone felt and no one discussed directly. The garage had never failed to fix a car. That record felt, suddenly, like something fragile. Harrison Mercer called twice on day 5. His assistant called 4 times. A journalist from an automotive trade publication left a message asking whether Elysian wanted to comment on reports that they were struggling with a high-profile repair. Vanessa did not return any of these calls personally. She had her assistant send brief, professionally worded updates that said everything was progressing without specifying what progress meant. But behind the measured language, Vanessa was beginning to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. The specific, nauseating vertigo of not knowing what was wrong. On the evening of day 6, Raymond was working along the far wall when one of the technicians, not Caleb, a different one, an older man named Patterson, who had been at Elysian for 9 years, restarted the diagnostic sequence for what felt like the 32nd time that week. The equipment powered on, the probes connected to the car's data ports, and the machinery went through its cycle. There was a sound. It was small. It lasted perhaps a quarter of a second, a brief, almost subliminal tick from somewhere inside the car's chassis. The kind of sound that diagnostic software does not always catch, because it happens in the instant before the system's sensors fully engage. Raymond, 22 feet away and pushing a mop across sealed concrete, heard it. He did not stop moving. He did not say anything, but his eyes went to the car and stayed there for a long moment. And behind them something shifted, the slow, internal movement of a very old understanding beginning to wake up. By the afternoon of day 8, the Bugatti remained silent, and Vanessa had reached the end of the possibilities she was willing to publicly consider. The replacement ECU had been located but would not arrive for another 18 days, which destroyed the auction timeline entirely. Every component that could reasonably be inspected had been inspected. Every theory that could be articulated within the boundaries of the team's considerable combined expertise had been articulated and tested and found wanting. Vanessa called a team meeting at 3 o'clock, and the 12 technicians who gathered around the central workbench had the weary, defensive posture of people who have been running hard for a week without arriving anywhere. She stood at the head of the table and began laying out, in the measured clinical language she used for all difficult conversations, The conclusion she had reluctantly reached. The ECU failure was irreversible without the replacement unit. Transport damage was the most likely cause, and the garage's contractual liability was limited by the circumstances of international shipping. She was composing, in real time, the framework of a professional retreat. It was Caleb who first suggested, carefully, that perhaps there were simpler diagnostic paths that had not been fully explored. Standard electrical checks, the kind of foundational troubleshooting that technicians sometimes skipped when working on vehicles as complex and prestigious as this one, because the complexity itself made simple solutions feel implausible. Vanessa had looked at him the way she looked at suggestions she had already considered and dismissed. "We are not troubleshooting a mid-range sedan," she said. "The diagnostic approach has been appropriate to the vehicle." Caleb had nodded and gone quiet. Raymond had been there. He was not supposed to be. His shift did not begin for another 5 hours, but he had come in early to retrieve a jacket he had left in the break room 2 evenings prior, a simple errand that should have taken 3 minutes. But something about the particular quality of the silence drifting through the corridor from the main garage floor had made him slow, and then stop, and the voices he heard through the partially open doorway were the voices of people at the edge of something, carrying the specific tension of a problem that has outlasted every solution offered for it. He had stood in the corridor for a moment, and then, because something in him that had been patient for a very long time was quietly done being patient, he had stepped inside the doorway and listened. When Vanessa finished her summary, and the room was quiet in the particular way of people who disagree but do not intend to say so, Raymond said, from the doorway, in his usual quiet voice, "Has anyone checked the secondary relay circuit?" The room did not react immediately. There was a beat, 2 beats of the kind of silence that follows a statement no one was expecting from a source no one was paying attention to. Then Vanessa turned, and recognition crossed her face, followed immediately by something much colder. "I'm sorry?" The words were not an invitation to repeat himself. They were a warning. Raymond kept his eyes on her, steady and unhurried. "The secondary relay," he said. "The auxiliary protection relay. It's a small unit, usually mounted near the firewall junction. On some models, it acts as a failsafe for the ECU lockout. If it gets knocked out of position during shipping, say, it can cut all signals without triggering any error codes that the primary diagnostic would flag." The room was very quiet. Someone at the back cleared their throat softly. Vanessa's expression completed its journey to somewhere recognizable. Contempt. Bright and clean, and entirely certain of itself. "The cleaning staff," she said, and the pause before the next words was calculated, "should focus on what they were hired to do." 1 or 2 people in the room made small sounds that were not quite laughter but were close enough to function as it. Raymond looked at her for another moment. Then he left. Caleb found him in the break room 20 minutes later. Raymond was sitting at the small table with a paper cup of coffee, not doing anything in particular, just being still in the way of someone who has made peace with a great deal of patience. The room was small and functional: a microwave, a refrigerator with a handwritten sign on it, a corkboard with shift schedules, and a few forgotten birthday cards that no one had taken down. It was the kind of room that existed in every large workplace, designed for brief occupancy, and receiving instead the weight of every break and bad day the building had produced. Caleb sat down across from him without asking if it was all right, because something in the situation seemed to make permission unnecessary. "How do you know about relay circuits on a Bugatti Veyron?" he asked. Raymond looked at the coffee cup. "How do you know I know?" Caleb thought about that for a moment. "Because you weren't guessing," he said. "You said it like you'd seen it before, like you'd fixed it before." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that is not evasion but consideration. Then he said, "I used to work on performance engines." "Before." Caleb waited. The word "before" was carrying weight, and he could feel it the way certain single words contain entire rooms of information that the speaker has decided not to open. "I was an engineer," Raymond said. "High-performance electrical systems. I did track testing for about 6 years, race environments, prototype development, the kind of work where the car failing means someone gets hurt, So you learn to be thorough in ways that classroom training doesn't teach you. Then I transitioned into design consulting. I worked with a European manufacturer on the development of their ECU protection protocols, the exact systems that govern how an engine control unit handles fault states and transport lockouts. He paused, including the relay configurations. He said all of this, the way he said everything, without emphasis, without drama, as though the information were simply being transferred from one place to another and the distance it had traveled was no one's concern but his own. "What happened?" Caleb asked. Raymond turned the paper cup slowly in his hands. "My wife was in an accident," he said. "She didn't survive it. I couldn't go back to the work after that. Too much of it was hers, the life, the travel, the cars. We had built that world together, and without her it didn't look like anything I recognized. I needed quiet for a while." He set the cup down. A while turned into longer than I expected. Caleb sat with that. There was nothing to say that would be proportionate to it. Outside the break room, through the thin wall, they could hear the intermittent sounds of the garage tools being set down, voices conferring, the roll of a cart across sealed concrete, and underneath it all, the silence of the Bugatti, which was still saying nothing to the people who were still trying to make it speak. In Raymond's locker, behind his spare uniform and underneath the worn paperback engineering manual, he had been slowly rereading for the third time since starting this job. There was a photograph. It was old, printed on paper rather than displayed on a screen, the edges slightly worn from having been handled, and then not handled, from having been looked at regularly for a long time, and then placed somewhere that was not quite out of reach and not quite within it. It showed a younger version of him, leaner, with his hair cut close, and his posture carrying none of the cultivated stillness that characterized him now, in a technical jacket with a manufacturer's logo on the chest, standing beside a prototype supercar on a closed test track somewhere flat and sun-bleached and remote. The car in the photograph was extraordinary, even in two dimensions, even in a photograph taken casually by someone who was more interested in documenting the moment than composing the image. Raymond was smiling in it, not the polite, closed smile he occasionally produced now when a situation required it, but the wide, unguarded, involuntary smile of someone who is doing exactly what they were built to do and knows it, who has found the thing in the world that fits the shape of their capability exactly, and whose body cannot help but express that knowledge. He had not looked at the photograph in months. He had thought about it, in the way that you think about things you have put away carefully, with the awareness of its location, the understanding that it is still there, if you need it. But he had not opened the locker door with that intention. He had not needed to look at it to know what it contained. It was still there. The situation with the Bugatti reached its crisis point at 10 o'clock on the morning of day 8, when Harrison Mercer arrived in person. He came without his assistant, which everyone understood to be significant. He was a tall man in his early 60s with the kind of controlled energy that suggested he was not accustomed to situations that did not resolve in his favor. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He stood in Vanessa's office and listened to her updated assessment, and then asked, very quietly, how it was possible that the foremost luxury automotive repair facility in the city, with unlimited access to expert consultants and diagnostic technology, could not identify the problem with a vehicle that had been functioning perfectly before a standard international transport. Vanessa explained thoroughly, precisely, with every credential she possessed, deployed in support of the explanation, and Mercer listened. And when she was finished, he said, "Find a solution by tomorrow morning, or I will need to involve my legal team regarding the breach of the service agreement." He left. Vanessa stood in her office for a long time afterward, looking at nothing in particular, and then walked out to the garage floor, where the Bugatti waited in its roped-off silence, indifferent and perfect and entirely maddening still. It was the garage's owner, a quiet, pragmatic man named Gerald Shea, who had built Elysian over 22 years, and who trusted Vanessa's judgment in almost everything, who found Raymond that afternoon and asked him, straightforwardly, and without apology for the abruptness of it, what he had meant about the relay circuit. Raymond told him, in precise technical language, exactly what he meant. Shay listened carefully, asked 2 follow-up questions, and then said, "Show me." Vanessa was standing 10 feet away when Shay called her over and explained that Raymond was going to spend 5 minutes with the car. Her reaction was swift and unequivocal. It was out of the question. It was inappropriate. It was not how Elysian operated, and she would not be responsible for whatever might result from allowing an unqualified individual access to a client's million-dollar vehicle. Shay looked at her. He was not an imposing man, medium height, quiet voice, the sort of person who was easy to underestimate until you realized that the place you were standing in existed entirely because of his judgment. "Vanessa," he said, "we are out of time and out of options." Let him look. It was not a debate. The garage went still in the particular way that large spaces sometimes do when something is about to happen that everyone senses but cannot name. Technicians found reasons to be near the Bugatti's roped perimeter, picking up tools they did not need, making notes on clipboards, moving equipment from one place to another, with the slightly unconvincing purposefulness of people who want to watch something without appearing to want to watch it. One by one, the ordinary sounds of the garage diminished until the ambient noise of the space was reduced to the hum of the climate control system and the faint sound of street traffic beyond the glass facade. Vanessa stood apart from everyone, her arms folded, her expression set in the determined neutrality of someone who has already decided how they will interpret whatever happens next. Caleb stood slightly apart from the others, feeling something he could not quite articulate, a cautious, nervous excitement. The particular hope of someone who has been rooting for an unlikely outcome and is afraid to want it too openly, who has learned from experience that wanting something too visibly is its own kind of vulnerability. Raymond walked through the perimeter without hesitating and approached the car. He did not pick up any diagnostic equipment. He did not connect any tools. He stood beside the Bugatti for a moment, looking at it the way he looked at everything completely, without hurry, giving it the full measure of his attention. Then he crouched beside the passenger side of the vehicle, placed one hand flat against the lower panel just forward of the door, and simply stayed there for a moment, very still, in a posture of listening so complete, it looked almost like prayer. Then he stood, moved to the front of the car, and asked Caleb quietly, without looking up, to turn the ignition to the accessory position without attempting to start the engine. Caleb did it. His hands were not entirely steady. The electrical system made its faint, characteristic sounds as partial power flowed through the car's circuits, and Raymond, standing perfectly still, heard what he had been waiting to hear. The sound was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the obvious wrong of something broken. The subtle wrong of something almost right. The sound of power reaching nearly where it needed to go and stopping, redirected by something small and out of place. He knew exactly where to look. He moved to the firewall area, asked for a flashlight. Caleb produced one immediately and directed the beam into the junction space where the auxiliary relay assembly was mounted. It took him approximately 45 seconds to find it. The relay was a small component, black, roughly the size of a matchbox, secured in its housing by a spring tension bracket. The bracket was intact. The relay was not damaged, but it had shifted perhaps 1.5 centimeters, perhaps 2 centimeters in its housing. The kind of micro-displacement that happens when a vehicle is loaded and unloaded from a transport carrier, when vibrations work through a chassis over thousands of miles, when something small that was precisely positioned, but a specific protection mode signal that told the engine control unit that the car was in a locked transport state and should not allow ignition. It was a safety feature. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was simply doing it in response to a condition that no longer existed, because no one had thought to reset it, because no one had thought to look. Raymond reached in with 2 fingers. He did not need a tool. He repositioned the relay in its bracket with the careful, unhurried precision of someone who has done this particular thing before, or something exactly like it, enough times to have memorized the feeling of right versus almost right. There was a small sound, a click, soft and definitive, as the component seated correctly. He stood up. He looked at Caleb. "Try it now," he said. Caleb got into the driver's seat. His hands were not entirely steady. He pressed the start button. The Bugatti's engine turned over once, twice, and then caught, and the sound that came out of it was not subtle, was not apologetic, was not the tentative sound of a machine uncertain of its own fitness. It was full and immediate and enormous. The voice of 10 cylinders firing in perfect sequence. The sound of engineering at its most extravagant, filling the garage from floor to ceiling in a wave of mechanical thunder that bypassed every rational response and went directly to somewhere older and more instinctive. Several people involuntarily stepped back. One technician, a 20-year veteran who had heard more engines than he could count, felt his forearms go cold. Vanessa, standing 15 feet away with her arms still folded, went a particular shade of pale that was not quite white. And her mouth opened slightly, and then closed, and she stood very still. Raymond stepped back from the car. He did not smile. He did not look at Vanessa. He looked at the engine compartment for another moment, just looking, the way he always looked at things, with the full attention they deserved, and then he said, to no one in particular, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, "Sometimes the biggest problem is the smallest thing out of place." The silence that followed lasted long enough to mean something. Gerald Shea, to his credit, did not let the moment remain symbolic. He was, at his core, a man of practical consequences. And what had just happened had consequences that needed to be followed. He called Vanessa into his office within the hour. He did not do this angrily. Anger was not his style, and he had too much respect for what Vanessa had built to reduce the conversation to blame. But he asked her, directly and without circumvention, to walk him through the diagnostic process, step by step, from the beginning. And as she did, the architecture of the problem became visible in a way that was uncomfortable for everyone who understood it. The secondary relay check, the kind of foundational physical inspection that any entry-level automotive technician learned in the first year of training, had not been performed. Not on day 1, not on day 2. Not at any point in 8 days of increasingly complex and expensive investigation. The reason it had not been performed was straightforward. Vanessa had assessed the vehicle's symptoms and categorized them immediately as a sophisticated electronic failure. And from that categorization, the entire investigative process had flowed. The diagnostic tools they had used, the consultants they had engaged, the components they had replaced, all of it was premised on a conclusion reached before the simplest physical checks had been made. The complexity of the vehicle had made simple solutions feel unworthy of consideration. And Vanessa's authority had made the team unwilling to suggest otherwise. Patterson, the senior technician, confirmed this privately and with evident discomfort. He had thought about the relay check on day 3. He told Shea quietly, but had not raised it because raising basic-level suggestions in front of Vanessa carried a specific professional cost he had not been willing to pay. Caleb had not known enough to know what to suggest, only that something felt off about the approach. 2 other technicians, when Shea spoke to them separately, described variations of the same dynamic. A team that knew things they were not saying because the person who needed to hear them made saying them feel dangerous. Vanessa's defense, when she made it, was honest in its way. No one could have predicted that the problem was something that simple, she said. She said it quietly, without the edge her voice usually carried. And in that quietness, there was something that might, in another context, have been the beginning of a different kind of understanding. But Raymond was standing near the door when she said it, and he said, still quiet, still unhurried, still the same voice that had offered the suggestion she dismissed the day before. You don't predict it. You look for it. You start at the beginning, and you work your way out. Every time, whether it's a Bugatti or a pickup truck. Vanessa looked at him. The look lasted several seconds. Neither of them said anything more. The investigation into Raymond's background, such as it was, took Gerald Shea about 40 minutes with a laptop and access to public records and industry databases. What he found was not hidden, it was simply information that existed in places no one at Elysian had thought to look, because no one had thought it relevant. Raymond Okafor had spent 11 years as a performance electrical systems engineer, the last 4 of which had been in a senior design, consulting capacity with a European automotive group, whose name, when Shay read it, made him sit back in his chair with a specific expression. The group was responsible for the electrical architecture of several high-performance vehicles, including the protective circuit design for a generation of ECU systems, systems whose protection protocols Raymond had helped design, and whose failure modes he therefore understood at a level that most practicing engineers never reached. He had left the industry 7 years ago. The public record of his departure noted only that it was voluntary. The reason was not documented anywhere official, though Caleb had already told Shay enough, in the careful, respectful language of someone conveying a private grief, that Shay understood what the record did not say. When Shay showed Raymond what he'd found, Raymond looked at the screen for a moment and then away. "That was a long time ago," he said. Shay said, "It was 7 years ago." Raymond didn't respond to that. Shay said, "I'd like to offer you an advisory position. You don't have to be on the floor every day. You don't have to be here at all if you'd prefer. But your expertise is," he searched for the word significantly more than what we're currently using it for. Raymond was quiet for a long time. The garage sounds moved through the walls, the steady, ordinary sounds of work being done. "I'll think about it," he finally said. Shay nodded. He had not expected more than that. What Raymond agreed to, in the end, was not the advisory position as it had been initially framed. He had no interest in titles. He had no interest in an office or a nameplate, or the kind of visible authority that came with institutional rank. He had lived inside that world once and understood its seductions, and he also understood what it cost, not the obvious costs, not the hours and the pressure, but the subtler cost of becoming someone who measures their own worth by whether other people can see it. What he agreed to was to work 2 evenings a week with the 4 youngest technicians on Alicia's staff, including Caleb, in informal sessions that were held in the break room or on the garage floor after hours, with no schedule and no agenda beyond the thing itself. Understanding. They were not trainings in any official sense. There was no curriculum, no certification, no record kept, but they were, in practice, the most intensive technical education any of those 4 people had ever received. He talked about systems, thinking about the way a complex machine was not a collection of complicated parts, but a single organism with its own logic, and how understanding that logic required beginning at the beginning every time, without exception, without assuming that yesterday's diagnosis applied to today's problem. He talked about the discipline of starting simple. He talked about the specific arrogance of letting the prestige of a problem determine the starting point of an investigation, how the more expensive the vehicle, the more its complexity became an excuse not to look at the obvious. He talked about listening, in all the forms that listening took. To sounds, to data, to the people in the room around you who might have noticed something worth hearing, regardless of their position on the organizational chart. He demonstrated, on vehicles that were in various stages of diagnosis, the kinds of foundational checks that sophisticated diagnostic culture caused people to skip, the things that were so basic they had become invisible, the physical inspections, the simple electrical verifications, the patient act of putting your hand on a machine and asking, before anything else, what it was actually telling you. The 4 technicians came to these sessions early and stayed late. And they brought notepads, and they asked questions that they had never felt safe asking in the formal structure of Elysian's technical hierarchy, and Raymond answered them all with the same unhurried patience, the same complete attention, the same voice that had once told Vanessa about the relay circuit and been laughed out of the room and was now shaping the next generation of the best garage in the city. Her suspension came formally from Shay 2 days after the Bugatti was started. It was indefinite rather than temporary, which was a distinction that everyone who heard about it understood immediately. The customers who knew her name were informed that the service team was undergoing restructuring. The journalist who had called about the Bugatti found, when he followed up, that Elysian was not commenting in detail, except to confirm that the vehicle had been successfully repaired and returned to its owner ahead of schedule. Harrison Mercer, told of the resolution by his assistant, sent a brief written acknowledgement of the outcome and a check for the full original service estimate minus. He noted with the kind of precision that people of his wealth applied to such things the cost of the unnecessary component replacements, which he had reviewed with his own technical advisor and identified as superfluous. Shay accepted the adjustment without argument. On a quiet Thursday evening, nearly 3 weeks after the Bugatti had first arrived, Raymond was in the main garage running his mop along the eastern wall, the same route, the same motions, the same quiet efficiency of a person who does a thing properly because they believe things deserve to be done properly, when Caleb came in from the side entrance and found him there. Caleb had been working late on a diagnostic calibration and had stopped to get his jacket. He almost kept walking. Then he turned back. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Raymond stopped the mop. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Caleb asked. "From the beginning, I mean. You could have said something. People would have listened to you differently." Raymond looked at him with the particular calm of someone who has considered a question long before it was asked. "If I had come in wearing an expensive suit and handed someone a business card with the right credentials on it," he said, "every person in this building would have listened to me within 30 seconds. He paused. "But that's not what I wanted to know. What I wanted to know, what I needed to know, was how people behave when they think you don't matter, when they think you're not watching, when they think the person mopping the floor couldn't possibly have anything worth hearing." He looked down at the mop handle in his hands, and then back up at Caleb. "This job showed me everything," he said. "I saw how this team handled pressure. I saw what kind of leader Vanessa was when things went wrong. I saw who was afraid to speak. I saw who wasn't." He glanced briefly at Caleb when he said that last part. "A title doesn't show you any of that. The mop does." Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment after that, with his jacket over his arm, and the specific feeling of someone who has just been given something important and is still working out its full weight. The garage stretched behind Raymond, familiar and luminous, its amber-lit surfaces reflecting back the shapes of machines whose value was measured in numbers that had always seemed, to Caleb, almost abstract until this week, when he had understood for the first time that the most valuable thing in the building was not the Bugatti or any of the vehicles on the floor, but the knowledge that walked in every morning in whatever form it happened to arrive. Credentialed or not, titled or not, visible or not. "Thank you," he said, which felt insufficient but was what he had. Raymond looked at him for a moment, steady and unhurried, the same way he looked at everything, giving it the full attention it deserved, no more and no less. Then he nodded once. The way he nodded at things briefly, completely, with a finality that was not dismissal, but resolution, and turned back to the work. The Bugatti left Elysian on a Tuesday, loaded with the same care it had been unloaded with, by a transport team that now understood, because Shay had spoken to them directly, the importance of checking relay positions after every loading. Harrison Mercer's charity auction went forward as planned, rescheduled by a week without significant consequence, and the car sold for $2,300,000 to a collector in Texas who planned to drive it once a year on a closed track in the Nevada desert. None of that had anything to do with what had happened in the garage, and yet it felt, to the people who had been there, like a kind of completion, the way a story that has been interrupted eventually returns to where it was always going. Raymond came in the following Monday, as usual, at 9 in the evening. The summer night was warm outside the building, the city carrying its ordinary sounds, traffic, voices, the distant bass note of a generator somewhere, and he walked through the staff entrance the same way he had walked through it every working night for nearly 2 years, with the same unhurried stride, the same gray uniform, the same quiet. The day shift team was filing out. Technicians in various states of decompression, some still carrying the focused energy of unfinished work, others already switched to something easier. Several of them passed him in the corridor near the staff entrance. A few of them nodded, not the reflexive, barely conscious nod of people acknowledging furniture, but a real nod. The kind that travels from one person to another and means something when it arrives. One of the senior technicians, Patterson, who had been at Elysian for 9 years, and who had spent much of the past 3 weeks in the uncomfortable space of a man reconsidering a great deal about what he thought he understood, stopped, and turned, and extended his hand. Raymond looked at it for a moment. Then he took it. The handshake was brief. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. There was, in that handshake, the kind of acknowledgement that does not require words, because words would make it smaller, that exists between two people who both know what happened and what it cost and what it was worth, and who have found, in the simple mechanics of one hand meeting another, a sufficient language for all of it. In the weeks that followed, the garage felt different, not dramatically, not in ways that would have been obvious to a visitor. But the technicians who had attended Raymond's informal sessions began asking more basic questions before escalating to complex ones, and began noticing that the basic questions often contained the answers. Caleb, in particular, developed a habit of starting every diagnostic session with a physical inspection before connecting any equipment, a practice that he would later describe to new colleagues as the most important thing he had learned from anyone in his career. He did not always mention where he had learned it. When he did, the explanation required more context than the moment usually allowed. From the guy who mops the floor, he would say, and then see the look on their faces, and decide the story was worth telling in full, because the story was this. In a building full of people who had been trained to see complexity as the measure of competence, who had learned that the prestige of a problem should govern the sophistication of its solution, who had organized themselves into a hierarchy that determined whose voice was heard before anyone had listened in that building, on an ordinary night, a man who mopped floors had remembered something that none of the credentialed, titled, celebrated minds around him had been able to hold on to. He had remembered that wisdom is not the same as knowledge, that the willingness to look at something simply to begin at the beginning, to ask the obvious question before the sophisticated one, to stay curious, without needing to be impressive, was itself a form of expertise that no degree could certify and no salary could purchase. He had not needed the title or the corner office or the respect of people who offered it only in response to symbols of status. He had needed to be in the room, with his eyes open and his ego quiet, doing what he had always done in every room he had ever occupied, paying full, genuine, unhurried attention to what was actually there. The Bugatti had not cared who fixed it. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to listen. And Raymond Okafor, in the gray uniform of a night cleaning worker, carrying 30 years of knowledge and 7 years of grief and an entire life's worth of the particular patience that comes from understanding how things really work. Raymond had been listening from the very first night. Knowledge makes an expert. Humility makes a great one.